Okay, I'm getting better at this. So here's the continuation of chapter 3. We're going to get into tissues and epithelial tissue. So we're going to go over some background of tissues. We've talked up until this point in this chapter about the cell, components of the cell membrane, properties of the cell membrane, cell division, all sorts of transport mechanisms. This and the next video will be a little bit longer than the last one, but not as long as the first one. And then the last video is pretty short. So we've got tissues to talk about, and we'll go through some background of tissues and some properties of tissues in general and the 4 major types. And then we'll start talking about the specific types like epithelial tissue. And we'll go into detail about those. So still some more, this is the first part of this lecture, is some background about tissues, and then we'll get into specifics. So like the body is organized, just to review, from molecules that interact to form cells, the basic functional unit or the living unit of the body. Cells combine to form tissues. So I've mentioned a bunch of times a heart muscle cell, a cardiomyocyte is the cell type, the major cell type of cardiac muscle tissue. So cardiac muscle tissue is a type of tissue. It's made up of cardiomyocytes, heart muscle cells. Those tissues combine together, like cardiac muscle tissue combines with other connective tissues and epithelial tissues to form organs. Organs form organ systems, and organ systems work together to create an organism. So just as a review, remember that. Here's the levels of organization. The chemical level, these molecules, atoms combine to form molecules. Molecules interact to form components of a cell. Cells combine to form tissues. And then tissues, here's the 4 major types of tissues that we're going to talk about. Epithelial tissue, connective tissue, muscle, and neural tissue. And we'll go into detail in this lecture about epithelial tissue once we get through the overview of tissues in general. And then we've got another lecture next on connective tissue. And then the last lecture in this chapter would be on muscle and neural tissue. So some basic background of tissues. Histology is a study of tissues. So when we look at tissues, we would look at tissues under a microscope to study them. And there's 4 primary types. Every organ in your body is made up of 1 or more types of these 4 tissues: epithelial tissue, connective, muscle, and neural tissue. Here's a figure that kind of describes that. Epithelial tissue is the most common type, basically. These cells combine and form tissues so epithelial cells combine to form an epithelial tissue, a particular type that form a barrier, or they cover an exposed surface. I've mentioned a couple times that your skin has epithelial tissue that you can see when you look at your arm or the back of your hand. That epithelial tissue is covering the exposed surface. It's your body. Or lining digestive organs or respiratory. So organs of the digestive system, like the small and the large intestine, are lined in their innermost layer by epithelial tissue. Same thing with respiratory organs and reproductive and urinary tract organs, like the urethra or the urinary bladder, are lined by, in the innermost portions, are lined by epithelial tissue. Epithelial tissue can also surround internal cavities and fluid-filled cavities. So epithelial tissue, we will talk a little bit later, you can find as part of a membrane. And membranes line internal cavities, like the thoracic cavity or the abdominal cavity, or the pleural cavity is created by membranes that have a layer of epithelial tissue. And epithelial also lines inner surfaces of like blood vessels in the heart. So I mentioned back in chapter 1, there was a layer of the heart called the endocardium when we started talking about the makeup of organs. The endocardium is the innermost layer of the heart, but it's a layer of epithelial tissue. We'll talk about it here shortly. So there's oftentimes when I'm lecturing, you'll see me talk about a slide with a bunch of words on it, and then the next slide will have a figure that would demonstrate the same thing. So I will typically toggle back and forth between the slide that has the figure and the slide that has the words. Connective tissue is very diverse. There's a lot of different types of tissues that are considered connective tissue, but it contains specialized cells and extracellular matrix. And the matrix is composed of mostly fibrous proteins and this fluid substance called ground substance. We'll talk about it in the next lecture, in the next set of slides. And that varies greatly with consistency. So some connective tissues are really fluid and some are really, really dense. Like blood is considered a connective tissue. It's very fluid and watery, but bone is also considered a connective tissue, which is really dense and thick. Muscle tissue has 3 types, and muscle tissues, its job is to contract, and it's unique in that it can do that by move the skeleton. So when you walk around, skeletal muscle is contracting so that you can move, supporting soft tissues. Like some muscle creates the walls of certain cavities, like the abdominal pelvic cavities, maintaining blood flow. So there's a muscle in the wall of blood vessels that can contract and relax to move blood through blood vessels, or help with that passage. Moving materials along internal passageways. There's also a type of muscle called smooth muscle that lines the digestive system organs. So remember that multiple tissues make up a single organ. So in the digestive system organs, like the small and the large intestine, there's an innermost layer of epithelial tissue. And then behind that layer, there's a layer of connective tissue. And then behind that layer, there's a layer of muscle. And that muscle can contract and relax and move food along the digestive system. And as well, there's muscle in the skin and muscle in the walls of blood vessels that also can help stabilize and normalize body temperature. So these 3 types of muscle, skeletal muscle tissue attaches to the skeleton. You have control over it. You can move around. Cardiac muscle tissue is only found in the heart. And smooth muscle you can find in the walls of like those digestive system organs, the small and the large intestine I mentioned on the last slide, within the walls of blood vessels, in glands, and it says along tracts. That's basically the example I gave you was along the digestive tract. And there's a figure showing the 3 different types of muscle. We'll get into detail about how to identify the 3 different types and what makes them unique in the last video of this chapter. Lastly, of the 4 types of tissue, the first 3 being epithelial tissue, connective tissue, muscle tissue, is neural tissue. We're spending not a lot of time on each of these right now because we'll spend a detailed amount of time, a good bit of time on each of these tissues and going into the functions and structures within each of them. So we're just spending a little bit of time right now as kind of an introduction to each of these tissues. The major cell type of neural tissue, and neural tissue is specialized to basically carry information from one area of the body to another. We can send neurons can send, which is the major cell type of neural tissue, neurons can send electrical impulses that are basically this electrical signal from one area of the body to another to communicate. Another type of cell you can find in neural tissue is called neuroglia. And there's a bunch of types of neuroglia we'll talk about later that isolate, protect, or support neurons. So they in some way help neurons do their job. And there's 2 divisions of neural tissue: the central nervous system, which is your brain, your spinal cord, and then your peripheral nervous system, which is basically what connects the rest of your body to your brain and your spinal cord. So epithelial tissue. So that's it for the background of just tissues. We have some basic. Here's the 4 types. Now we're going to go into these 4 types and discuss the specifics about each type of tissue. We'll start with epithelial tissue. Epithelia covers exposed surfaces or lines internal cavities. So covers basically epithelial tissue makes up a good portion of your skin, covering the eye. You have epithelial tissue that covers the part of your eye that you can see. Lining internal cavities like the thoracic and abdominal pelvic cavities. There's epithelial tissue there, or passageways. The examples I'll keep using are like the small and large intestine and the digestive system, or blood vessels. Blood vessels are lined at their internalmost passageway by epithelial tissue. You can also find it in glands like exocrine or endocrine glands. The functions of epithelial tissue in general, and we'll get into the specific types of epithelial tissue because there's a bunch of them, and their specific functions. So what you should know and learn and understand for this part of this chapter is how to identify the epithelial tissue, how to classify it, and what are the functions of these epithelial tissues, right? So what are some characteristics that would help you identify those tissues? You should be able to identify the characteristics of each type of epithelial tissue and the job or the function of each type of epithelial tissue. Basically, epithelial tissues provide protection from abrasion or dehydration or some kind of damage. They also are able to control certain types of epithelial tissue, can control permeability. So most epithelia is capable of, in some way, absorbing or secreting substances into or out of the cells. But some cells are more permeable than others, and some epithelial tissues are more permeable than others. Some can provide specialized sensation. So some epithelial cells can detect changes in the environment. Like there's an example of like a touch receptor. It's called a tactile receptor, that when you are touched, so take your finger, any finger, and touch your forearm, you can feel that touch, yes? Because of touch receptors. Those touch receptors have special properties that make them able to respond to that stimulus and send a signal to your brain to say you just were touched on your arm. And then glandular epithelial cells produce secretions. We'll talk certainly about those as we go. Epithelial cells have unique characteristics that are different than other cells in other tissues, like connective muscle or nerve. Epithelial tissue has two sides. So if epithelial tissue lines exposed surfaces or internal passageways, there's a free surface that's not attached to anything. That surface that's not attached to anything is called the apical surface. If you're lining a tube, if an epithelial cell is lining a tube, the apical surface is exposed to the space that's inside that tube or the passageway. It's called a lumen. The basal surface is attached to the tissue below it. So usually if there's epithelial tissue is usually attached or anchored to some kind of connective tissue. Well, it's anchored to that connective tissue on the basal surface, by way of the basal surface. On the apical side or apical surface, there's typically some kind of structure like cilia or microvilli that help the cells themselves do their job. So here's an example of an epithelial cell collectively that makes up this type of epithelial tissue. The apical surface is the free surface. Nothing is attached here, right? On the basal surface, the other side, the opposite side of the cell, underneath here would be some kind of connective tissue. So this basal surface is where epithelial tissue is anchored to the tissue below it. On the free surface is where where substances are passed, either into or out of the cell. And you can find cilia, little hair-like projections that help move things along a tract, or microvilli that increase the surface area of a cell by extending the cell membrane so that you can maximize absorption or secretion of any substances that are being moved. There's three shapes and several layers of epithelial tissue. So epithelial tissue is classified by its shape and by the number of layers it has in each tissue. So there's three shapes. One's called a squamous cell. They're flat and thin. One's called a cuboidal cell that are cubed in shape. So they're square. And columnar, which are more columns, tall and thin, or they're taller than they are wide. So there's squamous epithelium, cuboidal epithelium, and columnar epithelium. And then they're further classified into the number of layers. A simple layer of epithelium is just one layer of cells. Like there's simple squamous epithelium we'll talk about, or simple cuboidal epithelium, or simple columnar epithelium. Those are three specific types of epithelial tissue, all made up of, so simple squamous epithelium is made up of only only squamous epithelial cells. Simple cuboidal epithelium is a single layer of cuboidal epithelial cells. A stratified epithelium is multiple layers. So we'll talk about stratified squamous epithelium, stratified cuboidal epithelium, and stratified columnar epithelium. We'll talk about how to identify each of these types of epithelial tissue, where you can find them in the body, and what their major function is where you can find them. So you should know those three concepts as you get prepared for the quiz for chapter 3 and the exam 1. So again, identify the cells or identify the tissues, identify where in the body you can find those tissues, and what are their major functions. Here's the example of the 6 that we'll talk about. There's 2 more that don't really fit into this category. They're kind of odd, but we'll get to that. More functions of epithelial tissue are basically that those epithelial cells not only anchor to tissue below on the basal surface, and they do that by way of what's called a basement membrane. This basement membrane is the attachment between epithelial tissue and the underlying tissue, typically connective tissue. So at the basal surface, the basement membrane anchors epithelial tissue in place so that it doesn't get damaged or removed. And there's proteins between the basement membrane and the epithelial tissue that can attach to one another. So there's one point of attachment at the basement membrane, or at the basal surface of the epithelium. Epithelial tissue can also connect from cell to cell adjacently by way of some structures we'll talk about next. Epithelial tissue is also considered avascular. Vascular means vessels or blood vessels, and A means without. So epithelial tissue does not have a source of blood. It doesn't need it. It gets nutrients from the tissue that's below it that does have blood vessels. So the nutrients that it needs just diffuse from that tissue into the epithelial tissue. So epithelial tissue is avascular. It does not contain blood vessels. So here's an example, a couple examples, and we'll go into 2 specific examples of cell-to-cell connections between 2 cells. So we talked about the apical surface, nothing's attached on that side of the epithelial cell. The basal surface, that's anchored in place by a basement membrane, right? So anchored to the basement membrane. And then between 2 epithelial cells, there's more connections. For example, tight junctions. Tight junctions are basically use interlocking membrane proteins that bind one plasma membrane of one epithelial cell to the next plasma membrane of the next epithelial cell. And that prevents the movement of material substances like water and certain solutes between the cells. So think about a tight junction being a tight junction between 2 cells that won't allow anything to pass through. And that basically isolates the basolateral surfaces and deeper tissue contents, basically deeper tissue from the contents in the lumen. So the lumen, remember, is the passageway through a structure, like in the small and large intestine or in blood vessels. The lumen is the passageway where blood moves. So these tight junctions prevent the movement of substances from the blood to the tissue that underlies the epithelial tissue. So it's a protective junction or a protective structure that basically, if anything moves through the epithelial tissue, it has to move through the cells, not between the cells. And you can find these tight junctions in the digestive tract specifically. If you think about it, you're eating food and drinking liquid from your environment that could have some bad stuff in it. You don't want that bad stuff to kind of seep through the epithelial tissue into the underlying tissues. So these tight junctions prevent that from happening and keep you safe. So here's an example of 2 cell membranes. Here's one cell membrane and another cell membrane, and these are interlocking membrane proteins that create a tight junction. Gap junctions are a different type of cell-to-cell junction that interlock channel proteins that are called connexins. Connexins connect to one another and create a pore from one cell to the next. And that allows communication between the 2 cells so that small molecules and ions, for example, sodium ions, can pass from one cell to the next through that pore that's created by these cell adhesion molecules. They help coordinate functions like secretions and the movement of cilia. But they're also found in cardiac muscle tissue, and it's a really important property or a really important structure to have in cardiac muscle tissue. You can also find them in bone cells called osteocytes. Gap junctions are used for cell-to-cell communication to coordinate function in the heart and in bone. Right here's an example of a gap junction. So this whole structure is a gap junction. Here's one cell and the other cell, and these cells are able to communicate and send ions and small molecules through these pores because these connexins, here's one connexin, have connected and created this whole opening. So now we're going to move from just background information related to epithelial tissue to the specific types of epithelial tissue. So you should be able to identify these epithelial tissues. Tell me where in the body they can be found and what their jobs are. What's the function of each epithelial tissue? Like squamous cells, squamous epithelium. There's two different types, simple squamous epithelium and stratified squamous epithelium. Now remember from a couple slides back, what's the difference between a simple layer of epithelium and a stratified layer of epithelium? A simple layer is just one cell thick. So a single layer of squamous cells is considered simple squamous epithelium. Squamous cells are thin, flat, and irregularly shaped. To me, they kind of look like deflated footballs. If you view them from above, the cells look like a fried egg. Or if you look at them in a cross-sectional view, that's where I think they look like the deflated football. The nucleus is in the thickest part of the cell. It tends to be a small nucleus and a misshapen cell. So these don't really have a specific shape. They're called squamous cells. They're irregularly shaped. And simple squamous epithelium is pretty delicate. You can find it in regions such as what's called the peritoneum, that's in the abdominal cavity, in the walls of capillaries, the smallest blood vessel, or lining any blood vessel, you can find simple squamous epithelium. You can find simple squamous epithelium lining the chambers of the heart. That endocardium I've mentioned a couple of times, the innermost layer of the heart is a layer of simple squamous epithelium. And then the alveoli of the lungs are little tiny sacs of air in the lungs where oxygen and carbon dioxide are exchanged. The alveoli are made mostly of simple squamous epithelium. And these cells can absorb or allow substances to diffuse, like the alveoli in the lungs. Oxygen and carbon dioxide diffuse down pressure gradients pressure gradients, either into the blood or out of the blood. Remember, oxygen diffuses into the blood from the lungs, from the alveoli, across the layer of simple squamous epithelium, and into a capillary, which is another layer of simple squamous epithelium. So you can find this in a lot of places. And it also helps reduce friction. Simple squamous epithelium is part of membranes, and membranes are protective in the body. One of the ways they're protective is to help reduce friction, so that as organs move around, they don't get damaged. So here's an example. Right here's that simple squamous epithelium. If you look at it from above, it looks like a fried egg, right? The nucleus, and then this is one simple squamous epithelium, or one squamous cell. So you should be able to identify this tissue. Tell me where it's located, which we talked about on the last slide, and its function. Stratified squamous epithelium is located where a lot of mechanical or chemical stress exists. So think about areas of the body where you're exposed to the external environment. For example, your skin, or in your mouth, lining your mouth, your throat, your tongue. Down your throat is your esophagus. Anywhere you're exposed to the external environment, typically nearby is a layer of stratified squamous epithelium, where you could be damaged if otherwise there was a really thin layer. So stratified squamous epithelium is multiple cell layers of squamous cells. Many, many, many layers. Anywhere from 10 layers to 30 or more can be a layer of stratified squamous epithelium. And the superficial layer is most flattened. So take a look. Here's stratified squamous epithelium. So there's a layer. Here's a layer. Another layer. Layers upon layers upon layers upon layers. And this is stratified squamous epithelium from your mouth. So these superficial cells all the way to the deepest layer where there's some stem cells down here. Right there is the basement membrane. Remember, the basement membrane is what anchors epithelial tissue to connective tissue below it. So if this is the basement membrane here, down here's connective tissue. And the only way that epithelial tissue can stay anchored in place is by way of this basement membrane and then attachments from cell to cell. So all these cells attach to one another. Remember those tight junctions we talked about? Those tight junctions hold cells to cells, but the basement membrane holds this entire layer and anchors it to the connective tissue. In squamous epithelium, there's two different types of squamous cells, keratinized and non-keratinized. So basically, mechanical stress and dehydration are potential problems to any exposed body surface. Superficial layers, because of that potential problem, are packed with what's called keratin. It's a protein inside epithelial cells that basically creates a really tough and water-resistant environment for those cells. So if you think about it, drip some water on your skin. It doesn't soak up, right? It falls off. It kind of just rolls off to the side. That's because those cells have keratin, this protein inside that makes your skin tough and water resistant. So you don't soak up all that water. You don't basically diffuse it into your body or by way of osmosis. It just trickles off of your skin. So keratinized cells found on the surface of your skin are protective. They're really tough and they're water resistant. Non-keratinized stratified squamous epithelium basically resists abrasion, but it will dry out. So in like your mouth, your oral cavity, or your pharynx, which is the back of your throat, and then your esophagus, the pipe where food moves, those areas are a little bit more susceptible to drying out, but they're still really thick layers of cells, so they can resist abrasion. Think about it. If you've ever eaten something really hard and tried to swallow it, kind of feels like it's scratching your throat all the way down as it moves towards your stomach, but it doesn't completely damage. Like usually you don't bleed from that. That's because you may be kind of scratching off layers of epithelial tissue or epithelial cells, but you're not making your way all the way through that epithelium to where you could cause more damage. So this epithelial tissue, stratified squamous epithelium, its major job is to protect the underlying structures. And there's some figures that show you keratinized stratified squamous epithelium. The outermost cells are tough and water resistant. Cuboidal epithelium is next. So there's two types of cuboidal epithelium: simple, one single layer, and stratified, which is really rare. Cells basically resemble a hexagonal box. They're as tall as they are wide. They have a big nucleus at the center of the cell, takes up a good portion of the cell. And simple cuboidal epithelium, you can find lining glands like sweat glands or salivary glands in or around the oral cavity. Ducts in the kidney. There's a lot of ducts in the kidney you can find where simple cuboidal epithelium is located. Thyroid glands, lots of glandular tissue has simple cuboidal epithelium. Very rare, I think it's the rarest type of epithelial tissue is stratified cuboidal, and there's certain ducts of sweat glands in the skin and mammary glands in the breast that have where you can find stratified cuboidal epithelium. It's really hard to find. So here's a cuboidal cell, kind of a square cube in shape, about as tall as it is wide, and a big round nucleus at the center. Right there is a basement membrane that anchors that to connective tissue below, just one single cell layer thick of cuboidal epithelium. And there's an example of a cross-section of the kidney. This whole structure here is called a nephron. That's the functional unit of the kidney. If you cross-section one of the tubes of that nephron, you can see simple cuboidal epithelium here. There's the passageway. So remember, epithelial tissue tends to line passageways. Right here would be the passageway where urine is being produced. And urine is making its way through there. This cuboidal epithelium can basically secrete into this tubule or absorb from this tubule back and forth across from the area in the kidney. So basically, the job of cuboidal epithelium, simple cuboidal epithelium, is to secrete or absorb substances either into or out of areas like where urine is produced, this tubule, or into and out of the glands. Stratified cuboidal is multiple cell layers. So again, this is pretty rare. This is an example of a sweat gland in the skin that we'll talk about in the next chapter. So if you see the nuclei here, there's one layer of cuboidal cells and another layer of cuboidal cells. So with regard to cuboidal epithelium, where you see multiple layers of these nuclei, it's hard to see where the cell membranes are separated. So if you see nuclei stacked on top of each other, it's stratified cuboidal epithelium. Now, before we move on to columnar epithelium, there's one type of epithelial tissue that doesn't really fit into the categories that we talked about so far: squamous, cuboidal, columnar, stratified, or simple. So here is called transitional epithelium. And it's a stratified epithelium, so it's multiple cell layers, but they have this unique property. They can stretch without damage and recoil over and over and over again. It's called transitional epithelium because the appearance changes as it stretches. So it transitions from a cell that looks more like a cuboidal cell to a cell that looks more like a squamous cell. So this doesn't have one shape, like a squamous, a cuboidal, or a columnar cell. It actually changes shape. So it's called transitional epithelium. And it's found only in the urinary system. It lines the inner part of the urinary bladder and the ureters. These ureters are tubes that run from the kidney and transport urine from the kidney to the bladder. The only two areas in the body where you can find this epithelium is lining these two structures, the bladder and the ureters. In its relaxed state, in an empty bladder, the cuboidal epithelium, the superficial part of this transitional epithelium looks cuboidal, and it has a dome shape to the top. I'll show you this on the next slide, or you can look at the next slide if you're headed in that direction. And when it's stretched, like in a full bladder, the superficial cells flatten and look more squamous. So here it is. Here's cuboidal, or the transitional epithelium. This is the urinary bladder. So if you cross-section it and blow that up into a bigger figure, right, here's the dome shape, right? Here's the dome shape of these cells at their apical side. And that dome shape flattens out as the bladder fills and stretches, and they look more squamous, right? So it's a stratified layer of epithelium, but it's not categorized into one of the three major cell types or cell shapes because it actually changes shape. And you can find it, and its job is to stretch and recoil, right? So the function of this tissue is to stretch over and over and over again, and its ability to do that is required by those two structures. And you can find them only in the ureter and the urinary bladder. Columnar epithelium is taller than it is wide. It's more slender than cuboidal epithelium. And the cells are kind of rectangular. The nuclei tend to be elongated, so they're not rounded. They look more like an oval shape. And they tend to be close to the basement membrane, so the basal side of the cell. Simple columnar epithelium is the epithelial tissue that I haven't mentioned yet, but I have mentioned the structures or the organs in which you can find simple columnar epithelia: the small and the large intestine, the stomach also. So right here it just says intestine, but you can find it in either section, small or large. The gallbladder, fallopian tubes, which are uterine tubes, and also some ducts in the kidney, you can find simple columnar epithelia. They may have microvilli, particularly in the intestine. In the stomach, you'll find layers of microvilli to help increase absorption. Remember, microvilli are just extensions or folds of the cell membrane on the apical surface of these epithelial cells, or cilia for movement. You can usually find cilia on columnar cells in like the respiratory system. So here's some simple columnar epithelia. Remember, tall and slender, elongated nuclei, and here's a layer of microvilli. This is what it would look like on an actual slide. There's a layer of cells called pseudostratified. Pseudo means kind of fake, so it looks like it's a stratified layer of epithelium, but it's really only one cell layer thick. It is columnar cells. So these line nasal cavities, the trachea, which is your windpipe, larger airways in the lungs. So we'll talk about bronchi and bronchioles later, Some portions of the male reproductive tract, you can find pseudostratified columnar epithelium. These cells vary in their shape. They are columnar cells, but they're a really densely packed layer of columnar cells, so the shape kind of gets misshapen and misformed. The distance between the nuclei varies, and it gives the layer an appearance that it looks like it's stratified or layered. But every single cell attaches to the basement membrane, so there's only one cell layer thick. And these cells usually have cilia, not microvilli. So I want you to look back at the previous slide. Look at these nuclei in simple columnar epithelia. They line up really nicely in a row. And then there's a layer of microvilli here. Simple columnar epithelia. Now look at pseudostratified columnar epithelia. Look at the nuclei are all over the place. But right here's the basement membrane. All of these cells attach to the basement membrane, and typically there's cilia located here. Very different. One cell layer thick, all columnar cells, but look at how smashed around they get. The last type of epithelial tissue that we'll talk about is stratified columnar epithelium. And this is also very rare. Like stratified cuboidal, stratified columnar is pretty rare. 2 or more layers of cells. The superficial layer is columnar. So the superficial layer is the layer that's closest to the free surface, the apical side, where there's nothing attached. Those cells tend to be the most representative of the columnar shape. And these are found lining like salivary ducts or salivary glands and in the pancreas, two glandular sets of glandular tissue. Salivary glands produce saliva. In the pancreas, there is some ducts that you can find that either secrete digestive enzymes or transport those digestive enzymes into the digestive system. So stratified columnar epithelia, this would be an example of a duct. So right here's a salivary gland. It's called the parotid salivary glands. The duct that basically transports saliva from this gland into the mouth, the oral cavity, is lined by stratified columnar epithelia. And remember, the columnar, right here's the passageway, the lumen. The columnar epithelial cells located there are columnar in shape. The cells that are below it are still columnar, but they just kind of get smashed down into what looks more like a cuboidal cell. So if you're looking for what type of tissue, what cell type of tissue this has, you always look to the free surface, columnar. The cells below it, if it's a stratified layer, can sometimes get moved around and not look like they should. All right, and that is epithelial tissue. So we've now got background information on tissues in general. We've got epithelial tissue, and then what we're going to talk about next is connective tissue. So I will see you soon.